that it does. If you graph it out over time, you can say, well, it was impacted about right there. Interesting, okay? The Earth has obviously wobbled. There are all sorts of measurements and indicators to show that the Earth has wobbled in its history. What caused the Earth to wobble? Stonehenge is a strange solar observation point, apparently, built to study or worship the sun at summer solstice, but it doesn't line up today. Amun-Ra was built to study the sun, but it doesn't line up. George Dodwell, the famous Australian astronomer, got together all of the data on these solar observations, and he said, you know what, folks, it looks like something struck the Earth and caused it to wobble. Probably wobbled for 1,000 years or so, and finally stabilized. And today the Earth is tilted over 23.5 degrees. Well, George Dodwell got all this information together from the observations the ancient people made of the summer solstice, when the sun's as far north as it's going to get of the equator, which normally is June 20th or 21st. It varies back and forth from day to day, but normally the 21st. Okay? George Dodwell said that the graph that he made showed that the Earth had wobbled. And he noticed the wobbling curve on his graph was exactly the same as a top struck by an object. It appeared to him that something struck the Earth 4,350 years ago. Well, now let's see. 4,350 years ago is about the time of the biblical flood. So what happened anyway? Could it be that something struck the earth to cause the flood? That's part of the theory I'm going to give you tonight on what caused the flood in the days of Noah. Today the earth is tilted over, and that's what causes our seasons. And the first mention of cold weather is in Genesis chapter 8, after the flood. They may not have had any cold weather. See, if the earth weren't tilted over, you'd have springtime all the time. It would still be a little colder at the poles and a little warmer at the equator, but generally springtime weather all year long if the earth weren't tilted over. So it could very well be that that's the way the earth used to be. The next thing to keep in mind, the moon has craters on it, but the craters are not evenly distributed. See, if the moon were hit by meteors just over random chance over billions of years, the craters would be evenly distributed. But they're not. It's almost like a catastrophe formed the craters on the moon. The same thing on Mercury. The craters are not evenly distributed. So what happened anyway? Mars has canyons on it that are bigger than Grand Canyon, and yet there is very little, if any, water on Mars. How do you get canyons, erosion canyons, bigger than Grand Canyon? Whatever used to be on Mars that formed all this erosion is obviously gone. There are no giant oceans there. What happened to form the craters on the planets and the canyons on Mars? We'll cover that in the Hovind theory. The next thing you need to keep in mind, there is an effect called the Meissner effect, where two magnets will float. If one is placed on top of another, the magnet will float. How many have heard of what I'm talking about? That is called the Meissner effect, probably named after Meissner, would be my guess. Next thing to keep in mind, there are comets flying around through space, and these comets are extremely cold. Oftentimes, comets are flying around and they're 300 to 400 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Don't lick it. I need to find out now if anybody is or was as dumb as I was as a kid. How many of you have a piece of your tongue stuck to a pump handle or a flagpole someplace in the world right now? There you go. I got off the bus at school. My big brother said, hey, I bet you can't lick the flagpole. You know, some January day about 10 below 0. What's wrong with licking the flagpole? I can lick it if I want. Spend the next 10 minutes crying for somebody to come get some water and pour it on your tongue, right? Well, super cold objects exist in outer space. 300 to 400 below 0. Ooh, hey, now that's cold enough to freeze the mammoths. Normal 127 below 0 is not cold enough. Okay? The next thing to keep in mind, if you throw a snowball too fast, it'll break apart in midair. You couldn't possibly shoot a cannon or shoot an ice ball or snowball out of a cannon. It would break apart before it made it out the end of the barrel. There's a certain speed beyond which it will not go. It'll break apart. The next thing to keep in mind, the Earth has a magnetic field, and that's what causes the northern lights. As the energy particles from the sun strike the magnetic field, they are deflected, and most of them end up around the north and south pole. How many have ever seen the northern lights before? I've gotten to see them several times as I travel and preach. Just absolutely gorgeous, watching the sky light up. If you've never seen it, it's worth going to see the northern lights. Next thing to keep in mind, the pre-flood world was a lot different than the world today. A lot different. The Bible teaches there was water above the atmosphere, probably a layer of ice held up by the Meissner effect. This was mentioned in Genesis 1, 6, and 7. It's mentioned in 2 Peter 3 and mentioned in Psalm 148, water above the atmosphere. So the earth was a lot different. The next thing to keep in mind before we give you the Hovind theory, there's a guy in the Bible named Peleg. Who was Peleg anyway? If you're reading Genesis chapter 10, I hate to say this about the Bible, preacher, but Genesis 10 is a boring chapter. It's got all those big names in there that nobody can pronounce except Alexander Scorby. You know, so-and-so begat so-and-so, and he begat so-and-so, and you get all this begatting going on, and you come along reading, trying to do your daily duty and read a chapter a day to keep the devil away, and you get down to verse 25, and it says, unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of the one was Peleg. For in his days was the earth divided. This is the first time it makes a comment about one of these guys. Why does it say the earth was divided in the days of Peleg? And then it says his brother's name was Joktan. Well, Joktan means shortening. Peleg means divided. Joktan means shortening. What happened in the days of Peleg anyway? Well, we're going to get into that in the Hovind theory. What I think might have happened in the days of Peleg to divide and shorten, just like the Bible says. The next thing to keep in mind, the pre-flood world had a layer of water under the crust of the earth. This is mentioned in Psalm 136. It says, He stretched out the earth above the waters. There used to be a lot more water under the crust of the earth. That's probably what came shooting to the surface during the flood and caused everybody to drown. Most of the water for the flood did not come from the 40 days of rain. It came from the water that had been stored underneath. Subterranean water chambers. Of course, there's still a lot of water down there. Next thing to keep in mind, there might be 2 ways to look at things. How fast was that calf going? If you remember video part number 4 about the calf puller. So we're going to give you the Hovind theory tonight. What happened anyway? What caused all this to... What caused the worldwide flood? I made a conscious decision years ago. I decided I'm going to believe the Bible until somebody can prove that it's wrong. I had some friends I went to school with. They decided they are not going to believe the Bible until it is proven right. Maybe you heard about the atheist. He came to the preacher one day. He said, Preacher, I don't believe anything in the Bible. He said, You don't? He said, I don't believe nothing except you got to prove it to me scientifically. If you can't prove it with science, I won't believe it. He said, Preacher, if you can prove one verse scientifically, I will believe it. The preacher said, Well, okay. He grabbed the atheist around the neck and grabbed his nose and began twisting his nose back and forth. Pretty soon the blood was pouring down the guy's face. He said, Man, what are you doing? He said, I was proving the Bible. It says the wringing of the nose bringeth forth blood. Proverbs chapter 30. Anyway, I don't recommend you do that, but it does say that, by the way. What I'm going to do for the Hovind theory tonight, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you what I told you, and then when we're all done, we'll leave. So first I'll tell you, and then I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, then I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you what I told you, and then we'll be done. That's supposed to be a good teaching technique, they say. A quick review. Let's go through it very quickly. 8 points I want to get across tonight about the Hovind theory. Number 1, Noah and his family got safely into the ark. Number 2, a 300 below zero ice meteor came flying through the solar system, and it fragmented and cratered the planets and caused the rings around other planets. As this ice meteor approached the Earth, it shattered because of the inverse square law and the speed building up, and most of the shattered snow fragments and ice fragments were sucked in around the North and South Pole because of the strong magnetic field of the Earth. Number 4, the sudden dump of ice on the Earth caused the Earth's crust to crack, which released the fountains of the deep. It caused the Earth to wobble around for a few thousand years, maybe 1,000 years afterwards, and it caused the pre-flood canopy to collapse, and it completely flooded the world. So the water came from 3 sources: underneath, inside the crust, came from rain, and came from melting ice. That's part of the Hovind theory. Number 5, during the first few months of the flood, the dead animals would settle out in great swirling piles. As the water swirled around, you would get fossil graveyards. And the plants would pack and get buried into seams, and they would become coal later on, and you'd get fossil graveyards and coal formed by the flood. Number 5, during the last few months of the flood, the Earth, which had been cracked up now, the plates were unstable. These plates began shifting around and tilting, maybe plates as big as Texas, maybe plates as big as America. They would shift and tilt. As one place goes up and another place goes down, the water's going to rush off, carving Grand Canyon in a few hours. Water rushing off through soft sediments. Number 7, over the next few hundred years, the ice caps would slowly melt back. That would raise the ocean levels, make the oceans deeper, colder, and wider.